Hello and welcome to episode 22 of the Developers and Podcast, where we talk about everything in the games industry, but from the eyes of two indie devs. My name is Siavash, aka Rainy, and my co-host is over there, Sydney, aka Fam. Not that way, that way. This is flipped.
No,
so,
you were right the first. Oh, it is? Oh.
Yeah, that.
Whatever way. Some way.
That. Today we got another episode of How to Indie, and this one we are going to talk about the tools that you will develop alongside your game, the necessary parts that your players will not see, but your game cannot exist without them. Most of the time, there are scenarios where you might not need to create tools, but most of the time you need to do that.
And this is kind of a continuation. So the last podcast where we did How to Indie, we talked about just game design in general. And this is still kind of in the pre-production realm, in that you're not quite full on in development yet. You're still prepping. And we didn't really realize this until we were midway through it. We were like, oh, this is a thing that you have to do. So
yeah.
So it's pre-production.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those things that you don't consider it when you're thinking of becoming a game dev, especially like when it's like your first time making a game. So we thought it was an important one to get into, and we're this is still somewhat pre-production, but we are also going to be dabbling into production pretty much slowly, kind of fading that way. I'll just get into it. What are the development tools and utilities that you might need and why they're important? So what we're talking about here is essentially the little bits that you would create in engine that either yourself or your designers will use to create content for the game. So this can range from a simple fence system that allows you to draw fences easily and quickly, so you don't have to place down piece by piece. You can just draw a spline and it will spawn the fences around it. That is a development tool that your player is not going to interact with it, but you are going to use as a tool. Or it could be as expansive as something like a debug menu that allows you to check everything in the game quickly. That is, I think, probably one of the most necessary things, especially if your game is a little bit bigger. Because you're not going to play the game from the start every time you want to test something small. By the time you get to the point where you get the item in the game normally, you've forgotten what you were testing to begin with. So you are going to need debug menus to expedite this process. But also, if you have a team that isn't just a solo dev, if you have a designer with you, somebody who would want to make quests for the game, somebody who might want to create items in the game, you would also want to create tools that they can essentially make those bits and content and assets for it. And again, like I said, it can be as simple as something like a data asset, which we're going to get into a little bit more, or it can be as complicated as a whole UI with its own bits and pieces and input fields and buttons and all that.
Do you think it's important to point out that a lot of your knowledge is specific to Unreal and might be slightly different?
I think
in other engines?
Yeah, so I think some of the specifics that I might get into, like the data asset that I mentioned, might be a bit more specific to Unreal, but a lot of it can be, is just like general sort of, like what I say can be approached in different engines in however you can do it in the engine. But yeah, it's certainly something that not a lot of people talk about, but you realize that how important it is. A lot of people don't talk about it directly when you're like trying to learn game development, but there's definitely bits and pieces of it that you kind of come across and you see like, oh, tutorial on how to make, like I said, a spline fence system, or somebody has already made it and shared it with the rest of the community. So yeah, that is going to be the topic of today. Yeah. So what has been your experience, Sid, with how tools help SunnySide and what you interacted with?
I mean, I'm somebody who I don't do this stuff. Like technical things, computers are just not my jam. I'm the writer, historian, researcher, type person. So for me, having this every system that I needed to interact with be simplified made things easy enough so that I could get an engine and I mean, because it was only two of us for most of it who were touching the engine. We had some other people pop in sometimes, but we were able to have those other people pop in because you had set up those tools that made it easy enough for us to interact with it. So filling out data assets made things really simple, creating tables, adjusting tables. And I know there are a lot of things that had you not made those, I would not have been as useful, I don't think. So, and I think the other thing is you had full control over how easy it was for me to use.
Yeah.
So if I didn't understand it, I could come back to you and say, hey, this doesn't make any sense. I don't get this. And then you could tweak it so that we could understand it better. So sure. I think the main benefit really as a programmer is that if you want other people helping you, mostly to save time, it doesn't even have to be difficult work, but especially with a game like SunnySide, or even for a fighting game, when you think about all the different content that you have, if you have different weapons and different damage types and all this data that needs to be put in, it's the more tooling you do ahead of time, the more either time you're saving for yourself later on when you need to scale for content, or you're allowing yourself to outsource that stuff to other people who it's just data entry at that point, where they can just come in and type things in. I remember there was one thing that I was doing, I forget what it was, but it was so easy and the keystrokes were so repetitive that one, I probably could just made a macro for it if I knew how to do that. But I was getting tired. I had Kevin come over and he just started doing it. I didn't even have to explain to him what it was that he was doing. He was able to just, so it's that thing that you could just pass off to somebody, your roommate or your girlfriend or boyfriend or somebody who's in your life who's not into game design. You can have them come in. So insanely helpful. I don't think we could have gotten SunnySide done had you created the tools that you created, not just the data assets, but then later on it was all the stuff with the data tables to just import the Excel sheets and stuff.
Yeah. So you mentioned data tables. I think that's actually a pretty good place to start, because that's where I kind of started understanding the need for it. So if we rewind the clock to before SunnySide was even on Kickstarter, when I was just working on it on my own, I didn't find, there were probably good resources, honestly, but I didn't find any good resources on how to create an inventory, like, not system even. How do you keep track of all the inventory items? So for me, the first thing that I did was actually horrible. I had a game instance, which is like a blueprint that exists when the game is running.
I remember this.
Yeah. So there was an array of items in there that was supposed to be like all of the items that exist in the game, and then if I just want to add an item from it, I'll reference that array, which is horrible because it's just an array inside of a blueprint. The scalability was just terrible, not awful there. If you wanted to add any item to that, you would just have to add it to that array, and
impossible.
It was a mess. So you would want to, and for a lot of the object-oriented programming is something that we usually kind of default to, which makes it more difficult when you're thinking about managing tons of data. So you kind of have to think more like data management for a minute, which isn't something that comes natural with object-oriented languages and approaches. So this is something in Unreal, but it exists in Unity and Godot with just different names. So in Unreal Engine, there's something called a data table. A data table is essentially a CSV file at the end of the day. And a CSV file is essentially the simplest form of a spreadsheet. It's comma-separated values. And so you could start with a CSV file. I've seen a lot of people just keep their inventories, keep their items on a data table. Now, this doesn't...
Which we did, sort of, but not in the way you're describing right now.
No. So, and it doesn't have to be inventory items. It can really be any sort of data file that you want to keep, like a bunch of data that you want to keep. It could be a bunch of enemies and you want to keep track of their health, their name, their model, all that stuff. So there are some things that we did on data table. There are some things that we did on data tables, so data tables are a good approach, especially if you have a data set that isn't too large. But through my own experience, researching and trying to figure out what is the difference between a data asset and a data table, it turned out that a data asset for our inventories at least was the right approach. So why a data asset versus data table? So in a data table, every entry is a row on the CSV file. It's just a row of the comma separate values. A data asset, however, is a single file. And you can already see how, in terms of file management, it's so much better. You can put them in folders. You can see the files separately. If something goes wrong, you don't have to go through the whole thing. You can just change that one file. You can share those files. And your modders, people who want to make mods for your game, will love you for it. Because data asset modification is actually a pretty simple thing to do. SunnySide's already got a bunch of mods, and most of them are data asset changes. So in Unreal, you don't even have to do C++. There's some information out there that is incorrect. You just create a blueprint called a primary data asset, and then you can create data assets out of it. If you're in Unity and Godot, there's something that exists that is the same thing. Pretty much all game engines have something like this. So I said all of that to essentially give you guys a very good example of approaching a system in your game with two kind of mindsets in your head. One is expandability. So, if we want to add a new inventory item to the game, yes, there's going to be localization and stuff, but that needs to be done anyway. But when it comes to actually adding that item to the game, it's as simple as creating a new file and then setting up all the data inside of it, rather than having to interact with any kind of code. So you obviously set up all the variables inside of a data asset, and your designers can then create a new file, set up all the data inside of it, and sort it out. We'll get to automation a bit later.
That's a whole other. That's where the tooling comes in.
Yeah, but essentially try to, when you are dealing with a bunch of data, with a lot of data, you always want to find solutions like this to handle it. Some people might go even further and try to implement SQLs into their data management and all that stuff. I
just thought of something.
Yeah.
I just thought of a really great analogy. You know how I love analogies.
God. All right, go on, hit us with it.
Okay. So, I used to work at Disneyland. Everybody knows this because I talk about it all the time. And at one point, I met one of the night maintenance guys. And we were riding a bus together, so we had a nice long conversation. And I asked him, what is your least favorite ride to work on? And he told me it's a small land, because on small land, at the end of the night, when the crew goes home and they put the ride into maintenance mode, at the time, this was a decade ago. At the time, there was one switch to turn off. Let me backtrack. At the time, there was individual switches for every single model. Mm-hmm. Right? Hold on. Yeah. Okay. I want to make sure I get this right. There are individual switches for every single model. So if you wanted, and by models I mean the little animatronics that dance or whatever. At the end of the night, nobody's going to go through and hit all of them, right? Because it was too big of a pain in the butt.
Yeah.
But it was necessary, so if you needed to change one, you could go in and just turn off the one and do maintenance on the one item. So it was necessary, but everybody hated it. So because at the end of the night, when all the lights were off and the music was off, all you would hear is the clicking noises of the models moving around in the dark. And so it freaked people out. So later on, they retrofitted it and they did a universal off button.
Off button, yeah.
So you could turn all of them off and they wouldn't have to listen to them. But they still needed to maintain the individuality of each one so that you could turn off one to deal with it. And I bring it up because it's kind of a similar system in what we're talking about. Data tables are the universal switch, right? And you can't really pull out one thing. You have to change the entire item. Whereas the data assets are the individual switches.
Yeah.
So that if you need to do maintenance on one of them, you can pull one out, you can do maintenance, and you can put it back. So from a more physical standpoint, you need both. Having just the data table doesn't give you enough minute ability to change things, and having just individual switches means that you're listening to scary dolls in the middle of the night. Yeah. So if by what we did is we ended up having both. We had the individual assets we could change individually, but through tooling, we also had a universal kind of switch that we could hit that could change everything at once.
Yeah.
Good analogy?
Good analogy. I like that analogy.
Okay, yes.
So there's another benefit to using data assets rather than data tables is the fact that it's more kind to performance, because when you want to load an item, you don't have to load the whole table to then get that row off the table. You can just grab that item only, especially if you use soft referencing, which I highly recommend you do. You only soft reference all the inventories in the player, and then you only load it when it's needed. So if the player has storages of tons of items, it actually doesn't do any memory hit at all, because it's just a list of a list of addresses for where those files are.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, so that's what a soft reference is. It's just an address instead of everything loaded in there. So now you created your data assets, you're maintaining them quite nicely. One of the things that you will interact with the most in game dev, no matter what engine you use, is kind of crazy, is spreadsheets. Whether it's through Google Sheets or Excel. Like I said, data tables are CSV files. So as you can imagine, you could create a data table, which then connects to a CSV file that somebody can go and change on Google Sheets. And you can already see how collaborative it can become, because imagine you have, this is exactly what we do. There's a Google Sheet file with all the game items inside of it. I can see it.
Literally every single game item.
Yeah. And everybody can work on it.
One. Yeah.
And Sydney can go in, change a bunch of items on there. And then so now
we actually, sorry, real quick, I just, from a game design perspective, I want to talk about the benefits of the CSVs, is that we did it kind of twofold. So we have different sections of the game that have their own CSV for balancing purposes. And that's where all the actual design took place. So let's say the cooking system, we had one sheet that's just all of the recipes, right? Yeah. So that we can figure out how much time does this take to cook versus this thing. We can make sure everything's balanced. Same thing with the game items. We had one that was just the actual items that you cook. And we had another one that is just all of the forageable items that you find in the world. We call them world items. There's another one that's all of the fishing lures, so that we could balance out what they all do. So we had a ton of different sheets spread all over the place of here's the data sheets for actually designing everything. Once we were happy with it and it was settled, those sheets got imported to a master sheet. And then the master sheet is what was used to interact with the engine. And from the master sheet, the benefit of that is, one, you can compare things across systems. But then two, your import's just a couple clicks, right? And again, we're getting further into the tooling aspect of what Rainy set up for importing. But from a design perspective, it meant a schlep like me could go in and just interact with a Google Sheet to plan everything. And then Rainy would actually do, I would say, the hard part, but the hard part of actually getting it into the engine. And then if I know that something, if you guys report a bug to me that says, hey, this thing, the dollar number is off or whatever, or the decimal for the price is in the wrong spot, which actually did happen, I know enough about the engine to go into that one data asset and just change that one value, rather than having to go back and change the sheet and then re-import everything. So it gives us it gives me as the designer a lot of points of contact for interacting with everything. So
now you might be wondering, how do the data tables and data assets even kind of connect? So how can I even use these spreadsheets to control data assets? Because data assets are not actually connected to any sort of CSV files. So like I said, we did SunnySide and Unreal, so I'm going to use Unreal as an example, but you can probably find parallels to whatever engine you use. In Unreal, there's a kind of widget, which is like a UI element, that is called an editor utility. Essentially, it's the same as a normal widget, but it can run in the editor. It doesn't have it doesn't need to have the game running for it to work. So you can already see tons of potential for creating your own tools in Unreal, where you can put buttons that do things. You can have a button that spawn a bunch of things in the world in front of you. You can have a button that copies a bunch of files for you. We had a really simple one that actually I started with, was a renamer, which you would give it a name of something to find in the name of the file and then replace it with something else. That's how we quickly went through and imported a bunch of portraits for the characters. But essentially what you can do, and the implementation that I did, was essentially creating a data table with a structure full of strings. So this would be the name of the item, the icon for it, the price for it, the localization code for it, all of that stuff. And then Sydney would kind of copy that exactly into the spreadsheet as the engine would be able to read it. So then we would end up with a data table with all of this information inside of it. Still not connected to anything, just a data table with a bunch of strings that it doesn't mean anything to the engine. So then through this editor script utility system, I would essentially read each one of these values, and obviously I know what they are supposed to be. So if it's an icon, then I would try to find an icon with that name and give it to that data asset. If it's a localization code, I would try to find it inside of its data, inside of its table, inside of its string table, and then try to give it to the data asset. So essentially, you can create a little tool that allows you to import a CSV file into the engine and automatically goes through each data asset and update the data inside of it. We didn't use it just for that. We also used it I wrote a little script that would tell us if an item is missing an icon. I wrote a little script that would tell us if a build item was missing a mesh. It's really simple. It would just grab all of the files that exist, go through the icons. If the icon was a null, it would just print an error, give me exactly what file it is, and then we would be able to go through it. We have 1,900 inventory items in SunnySide, so this was more than necessary for anything.
There were also some downsides to it, I remember. So like we did imports for like the skill tree.
Yeah.
Right? But it was like grabbing the wrong items because it was just like looking at the first word.
Yeah. It was not
like
accurate
the whole
enough.
thing. Yeah, and so there were a lot of, and I think it's still true. No, I think we got all of them. But there was a while where it was something that was like, I don't know. It was obvious that it was supposed to be something else for that particular branch, but because of the way that the script was, it was grabbing items from like somewhere else completely, which felt a little bit weird. But so you have to be careful with how you do your tools to make sure that they're super accurate and not grabbing weird stuff. I think it happened with the icons at one point too.
Maybe,
got all the icons flipped around because of how they were named.
I think it was the build items, yeah.
Build item, yeah. So you have to be super careful that, one, and I would actually say from a design perspective, this is something you need to implement very early on, is consistent, planned naming for how you're going to name things. Because what kind of makes sense to you at the first time when you're just kind of putting it together, you'll get to the point where you're interacting with other systems and suddenly the names don't make any sense. Especially with Unreal, didn't we find there was a limit to like how long a name could be?
That is, I think, for any engine.
References, so if you're naming your icon, if you're naming your icon,
well, we had animations that were like that, like sitting.
Yeah, if you're giving it a whole
skeleton. Frame rate, everything,
exactly, so you need to be very careful of what kind of naming patterns you use. We started abbreviating things a lot more as we got further in, and it's beneficial to you. We didn't do this, but I would highly recommend it, having a master sheet of what all your abbreviations mean. So that you don't have to, you're not killing yourself trying to remember what everything is. You can just have a quick reference. So definitely with all of this, with controlling your data assets, with doing your spreadsheets, with everything, organization is insanely important, especially for a game like ours. We had, how many arguments did we have just trying to figure out how the folders were going to be set up?
Well, actually, on that topic, organization is very important. And, I can't give you a correct answer. There is no correct answer. The correct answer is to have some sort of organization in place, because there is two school of thought on this that people subscribe to.
Yeah.
The first one is essentially having a folder per item type. So you have a folder full of static meshes, you have a folder full of textures, you have a folder full of UI elements. Another approach is you have a folder per category of thing in the game. So you have a folder called core mechanics, and then you have a folder called character, and then inside of that folder then you have your models, your blueprints, your textures, everything in there. Some people prefer one over the other, and some people mix the two. We actually did that.
We mixed them,
and it worked better for us at the end of the day.
And I hated it. I liked it, I didn't like it. In some cases, I really wished that all the materials and meshes and textures were all together. So that I wouldn't have to go searching for them.
Yeah.
But so that if, but again, with Unreal, the benefit is you can click on it, you can look at references, you can still find stuff. So it wasn't really a big problem. But on the flip side, the thing that I did appreciate having separated out were things like icons. When I needed to import icons, I can see all the icons at once, and I can just add it. And then and you can, like I said, you can always just click file reference viewer, and it takes you where you need to go. And so it's not.
There is another benefit to the initial one too, is the fact that when you want to do bulk changes, it's just one folder to go through them.
Exactly.
And then make the changes that you need to do. But at the same time, you can just search and do the same thing. So where the organization really comes to be very important is what we're talking about. There's a limit to the file referencing that you can have. So and that's not the file name, it's the address. So
if you have to go through 1,000 folders to get to something, that folder hierarchy
the file path,
is the address the address for the item. So if you have folders with 30 characters for each folder, or if you have 100 different folders that you have to go through, it's adding to the length of the file address, and you will, and we did, run into errors if those file addresses are too long. So that's why you really need to figure out your organization and make sure it's consistent. And I think the reason that we ended up kind of mixed up is because we did so much of our pre-production kind of got interwoven with our actual production. And so you had systems that you had set up that when I came in, we changed it, and then we had other people come in and we changed things again, but we didn't actually get rid of the old things. And so, or we would just rename them as like old or deprecated, and then, but they'd still show up when you're trying to find things, and it kind of became a mess. Lessons to learn, in game development. So in terms of for you guys as lessons from us on pre-production, on tooling, on all that stuff, get your shit organized. Make sure you have there's a word for it, I can't, but like a standard operating procedure of how you're going to name files, what your file addresses are going to look like, and decide where your planning is going to be, what your spreadsheets are going to be, because we didn't even figure that out until, again, like halfway through. We had done so much of our pre-production in a program called Nuclino, which was just to organize ideas, and that wasn't really useful for anything. And it wasn't until much later when we kind of moved over to Google Sheets and we realized, oh, this is how we should have been doing this literally this whole time. And the further we got into it, I was making sheets for everything, for production purposes and keeping people on task and checking off things as they're getting done, to actually designing and balancing things, to full-on implementation. We finally got to the point with importing the items and stuff. So you need to figure out, we had talked about previously figuring out what engine to use. It's not even just what engine, but what programs and assistive tools are you going to use? Are you going to use a planning thing like, what was it? Fire.
What are you thinking about?
It's like a program. It's like a website that you can use for story design and game design and stuff, which I'd like to start using, but I can never remember the name of it. So, are you going to use something like that? Are you going to do everything in Google Sheets? Are you going to use the whole Google Suite like we did, where we used it for file storage and sharing as well? Or are you going to use something else? What kind of production tools are you going to use? There's a lot of them out there, Kanban boards and stuff like Nuclino or Asana, which we used at one point. So there's a lot of decisions for you to make, and a lot of these things you're going to come to kind of as the need arises. But the more you can get ahead of it and not waste time testing things like we did of what works best. I mean, we went through how many production tools on the back end?
Quite a lot. Try to land
so
on
many.
One,
trying to find
what was
something
that
that
one
works.
that we used for a little while, which is the one I brought from my previous work that you had to pay for? It was a Kanban board.
Oh yeah. Trello.
No, not Trello.
Oh, you were on Trello for a little while. When I first joined, it was Trello.
Yeah, no, this was the one where everybody was on as well. We all had timelines and everything.
What?
Yeah, we all had work timelines and work slots that we moved around, and we had milestones on
That
it.
was Asana.
Asana. That was Asana.
Oh yeah.
So
okay.
we
Yeah, I
used
mentioned Asana,
for
so
a
I was
bit.
like, "What are you talking about?" Yeah. We use Asana as a production tool, for mostly for production, meaning the producer.
And Perforce is a very good tool as well that you could also use. What was it called?
Yeah, it's called
Helix,
Perforce. Yeah, Perforce is the parent company is like Helix. I think. Correct me.
I'm pretty sure you're right. Yeah.
But Helix, they have a whole bunch of new stuff that we've been wanting to use, but it is on the more expensive side. I wouldn't really recommend it for a first-time indie studio, because you have to pay per seat for people who are using it, and it can get really expensive. But the stuff that it can do is amazing, in terms of collaborating with other people. And putting up documents, being able to edit them and circle them and make notes and then pass them off to other people, and file sharing, and the way that we're not sponsored by Perforce or anything, just for the record. Yeah. It's just a cool system that we use.
System, yeah.
They
but
did give us also
something private tool.
Yeah, cool. Yeah. But another thing that they had is something that I found I would love to have as a producer. Anytime that you would assign a task, the timeline of the task would kind of come with it. So as a producer, your main job is figuring out how long are these things going to take. So, I give a task to Rainy and I say, hey, I need you to make this thing, or, Ken or Modeler, hey, I need you to model a chair. How long do you think that's going to take you? He tells me, I think it's going to take 6 hours. And so I figure that out in his timeline. I give him the space. But with what this program in Helix can do is you have model chair 6 hours as like a thing that can get done. And then when you assign that to people, that kind of timeline task goes with it. And so it's cool. So if you're on the more AA side of things and you're looking for production tools, that's one I would highly recommend checking out.
I think it was called
say you want
Helix
a meeting.
Dam, was it? No,
the Helix Dam is that specific one.
That's the photo library thing. I actually can't find the board, like the Kanban software.
It's part. Yeah, I think it's part of Helix Core.
Okay, probably.
But anyway, they'll give you free sales meetings. Just call them up, say, hey, I want to check out your stuff, and they'll walk you through it. It's pretty cool. So that's just one of a million. A lot of people are also really familiar with things like GitHub or Dropbox, or and it's just a matter of what works best for you. We chose Google because we were already kind of using it. So we used it for a lot of file sharing and stuff. We also used OneNote. We use a lot of Microsoft tools. OneNote specifically, the reason I like OneNote is because it does the things that Helix Core does, in that if I have an artist who's submitting artwork to me and they need me to tell them what needs to be changed, I can take a screenshot of it, drop it onto a OneNote, and I can draw on it. And then I can take another screenshot and send it back. So that made it a lot easier for me.
They renamed it, sorry.
What's
it called Handsoft, right? Remember?
Handsoft, yeah.
They call it Helix Plan now.
No, okay.
Yeah, and then you can try it for free, apparently. If you, like Sydney said, if you're into AA, definitely give it a go.
Okay.
I don't think it's that friendly to solo developers or something, but they might have plans.
Probably
I don't know.
not, yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's a lot of stuff out there that you can definitely use to make your life easier on just the outside of whatever system you use. And keep in mind how those things are going to work with whatever engine that you've chosen and stuff. So for us, the benefit of Perforce is Perforce has full integration with Unreal Engine. So it made it easier for us to set up sharing as a fully remote studio within Unreal to just connect it to Perforce, and it just works, and we don't have to put any more effort in file sharing and stuff. So you gotta use whatever's best for you, whatever works for you, your studio. If you're, you know, a solo dev or an indie studio or AA or even AAA, they're gonna have stuff that works for them and whatnot. But in terms of creating game development tools within Engine to help yourself, I mean, you know, we talked about data assets, we talked about data tables.
Well, there's one other area that I wanted to quickly touch on as well, which is the second half of it. So this is just as important, if not more, honestly, because you can always brute force the first half of this whole thing. You can still brute force all of the item importing and stuff. It's just going to take you a lot more of a muscle to do. Yeah. And elbow grease. But the second half of this is something that you have to do. So what I'm talking about are tools and utilities that go inside of the game itself when the game is shipped. So the most common thing to do in this is a debug menu. A debug menu can be as simple as a teleport menu, which is funny enough how I started actually. It was just a teleport menu that you could go to different areas in the map, so we don't have to run around so much. And then we kind of expanded it, and we added stuff like you could change the time of day, you could make the time go faster or slower. And then it got expanded where you could look inside what story beat each character is on and adjust friendship values and
stuff.
Would
you say, from our experience, would you say that you almost need to plan ahead that you're going to be implementing a debug menu and add things for each system as you implement those systems?
That is a good idea. The thing is, in my opinion, they kind of come hand in hand. So you don't even have to plan for it. Because if there's a trigger that can happen in game, you can most likely trigger it through the debug menu anyway. Yeah. If there's like, I don't know, turn on flashlight is when you press F. You can also make it turn on by pressing a button on your debug menu. But it is good to try to put checkpoints in your game where you can go to. What I mean is like
plan for the idea that you need to be implementing debug as you're putting in.
Because you're gonna need to.
Don't wait until later. When you're like, oh God, we don't know how. You know, for us, the biggest one, like, oh my God, this is a game changer, is being able to look inside the social system, like you said. And I don't think we realized how badly we needed that until we were long past having implemented it.
I'll give a little backstory of what was going on. So our social system is designed in a way where there are story events that are data assets, what a callback, and then each they all trigger based on a set of conditions, whether you have met certain friendship points and romance points with certain characters, group of characters, whether you have gotten this event before this event, who are you inviting out, what time it is, all of these kind of go into it. So you can imagine if you want to try the 12th friendship event from this very specific character, if you want to do that normally, you have to play through the game, and that's almost impossible. So we essentially needed a system that could look through the back end of the social system and see exactly what is set up, what is coming up, what events are happening. So the systems like that are absolutely necessary for your QA team and yourself, because the quicker you can test your fixes, the quicker you can implement them. Honestly, I feel like one of the reasons we've been able to bug fix as quickly as we have in the previous patches that we've done has been thanks to a lot of these debug menus. Because I can just quickly go around, do a fix, and then I can immediately test it out. And I mean, how quickly a fix can come based on what system it's on. If it's a fix to the social system, you always know it's going to take a tad bit longer because of all the preparations. Whether if it's like I can't exit out of this menu. Recipe not working. That's like
if it's a recipe not working, that's easy enough that's something I can go in and fix. Whereas if it's a menu not working, that's all Rainy. If it's something to do with the social system, it depends on what it is. Most of the time it's an issue that's in a data asset that I can go in and fix somewhere. But if it's a matter of what the programming is interacting with, that's a Rainy thing. So I think the benefit for us is because we've implemented all these tools that I can access, it means we now have two people who can bug fix instead of just one. And so there have been entire things where it's just been, I know exactly what that is. Rainy doesn't even have to touch it. I know as soon as I read it that it's something that I can do, and I'll just assign it to myself, and we just keep going. So I think, again, it's the more tools you have, the simpler it is for plebs to deal with the engine. Yeah. And as a happy pleb myself, I appreciate it because the more, at the end of the day, the more diversification you have on your team, people who are able to interact with multiple things, the better off you're going to be. You know, something like Ken, we didn't even have Ken in the engine for the longest time.
Yeah.
And then we finally got him in, and we finally got him into the engine. We're like, oh my God, this would have saved us so much time.
Just again, a bit of background. Ken joined the team as a modeler, and now he's more of a generalist. He modeler and animator. So by having him in the engine,
and rigging, yes, that's he's very proud of the rigging.
By having him in the engine, it removes a step where if you wanted him to make a change to a model, he can just go ahead and import that change into the engine without us having to do it. So the more of these frictions you can remove, the better your production line is going to be. I mean, it's as simple as that.
The way it was working is Rainy would have to export it, tell him where it is in Google, and then he would have to download it and then fix it and then re-upload it, and then Rainy would have to put an engine. But we finally got to a point where it's like, this is stupid. Let's just show Ken how to do it himself. Yeah. And so at that point, you know, we tell him what it is. I just tell him where the file is, and he can go in, grab it, do it himself, fix it. And next thing I know, when I log at Perforce and I pull all the changes, it's fixed and I don't have to do anything. So it definitely saved us a lot of hassle. I think same thing too. You know, at the very beginning, I didn't really touch a whole lot of anything in engine. And then now I'm at the point where I'm modifying textures and I'm, you know, so it's amazing how far these engines have come. And there's just a little bit of work from your programmer. Your developer can make the engine more accessible to your designers. And the closer the designers are to the engine, the easier everybody's life is going to be, really. Because I would argue there are probably areas of the game that you haven't touched at all.
Yeah, probably.
Since implementing the tool, and it's just been me.
There's certain cutscenes and like social systems and stuff that I haven't touched, or recipes and whatnot.
Yeah, you haven't really touched the recipes at all except to import them.
I'm like,
so it's just me.
I work on the system, and then you tell me if it's working or not.
and had you not created those tools for all of that stuff, could you imagine you having to be the one to do all that?
Oh God, yeah, that's just impossible. Yeah, and you know, at the end of the day, one massive benefit that it becomes that it brings with itself is that the more you are familiar with what's going on in your designer's head, and the more your designers are aware of the limitations of the engine, the better the outcome is going to be.
That was the last thing we wanted to talk about. Was if and that's why we wanted this to be part of pre-production. Is you have to know how the system works before you can let your designer start designing. And we didn't do it that way. We designed first, and then we programmed to the design. And the problem with that was you don't know the limitations of the programming when you're designing. So you kind of have to work together for a little while to create a test, a demo, a whatever, to see what the design's even going to be. And you have to work together, designer and programmer, of what's the program capable of, what's the programmer, what's your, because you have your limits just like anybody. What can you do versus what can't you do? And then from that point, once you've agreed on it, now we can implement actually designing it and expanding it and creating everything that's going to go into it. But I feel like you can answer this better than I can. There are quite a few systems that I designed it first, and then you went to program it and went, we can't do it that way. What were you thinking?
More than you can imagine.
And then me going back and going, no, we agreed to this. You were there when we had this conversation. And then you being like, I didn't realize what I was not going to be able to do. So, and then having to redesign the entire system to meet the needs of the programming, where had we done that on smaller scale first and just figured it out, I think we would have had so many less headaches.
I have a general advice, if I may be so bold, to give to everyone for life, not just game development. When you're tired, if you're tired, don't just say yes. Don't just say yes. Say I'm tired. Say we'll talk about it later. You will be surprised how much grief you will save your future self.
It's true. That's good advice, I think, for like any relationship too. Don't just agree.
Don't just agree because you're tired or you can't be bothered. Just say you'll
because that happened to us
consider it
a
later.
lot.
Yeah.
Of me coming to you and say, hey, I'm working on this right now. Is this okay? And you'd be like, fuck it, I don't care. Yeah,
I don't care. Ahead. I just want to get off. Yeah.
I just want to go to bed. And then I've designed the entire thing. I'm like, okay, it's ready to go. You can implement it. And you looking at it going, I can't implement this. What were you thinking? And then me getting pissed off because I was like, well, you said that this was fine. Like, well, I didn't really think about it. It's like, well, whose fault is that?
Yeah.
It's yours.
Well, thank you for listening to us. I think I hope that this helped you in your own project. And if you are in the game dev and you're just curious about game design, I hope this gives you more insight about what goes into game development.
And I want to do. We kind of stopped asking questions at one point, so I kind of want to do another question of the week. Should it be like a question for game developers? Something that both people can answer.
Both would be
I'm
preferable.
thinking, I don't know. Is there anything that you'd want to know from the masses?
Well, for game developers, share your stories of the thing that you found in game development that you never expected you would have to do as part of the job. Yeah, that is something that I'm always finding very interesting answers to. And if you aren't a game dev, tell us how surprised you are by hearing some of the jobs that we have to do.
This is.
Yeah, like I do come across friends of mine where I'm explaining something to them and they're like, why do you have to deal with this? I didn't think this was part of game dev. But you do almost anything when you're a game dev. So do let us know what part of it surprises you the most.
The analogy I always use is we're making movies, but we have to create everything from scratch. Mm-hmm. We have to make the environment. We have to make the shooting location.
And worry
about create the actors.
How it's going to play out because it's completely out of our hands. Yeah. Like
it's a whole reality you have to create.
Yeah, that is one difference that is always you got to keep in mind is that when you're making a movie, animation, video, whatever it might be, the end product is exactly the same as you see, as they would see. Yeah. When it's a game
design,
not exactly the same thing.
Every device is different. Could you imagine if we went and bought movies and movies played differently on every single device they played on?
Yeah, like, this actor is just not loading in suddenly in the middle of a very important cutscene because my hard drive isn't good enough. Yeah, it's just what. All right, well, thank you again.
It'd be so different. Answer. Let us know what you guys think, and for this is one of the extended versions. For the How to Indie series, so that everybody can get access to
these episodes.
Awesome advice.
Yeah, we release these episodes as extended versions only publicly. So if you'd like to support us on Patreon, you can do so down below if you like.
We appreciate it.
And our bi-weekly episodes of the State of the Industry are the ones that extended version goes to the our Patreon backers only. So we will see you next week on another episode of the State of the Industry. You have a great rest of your day. We'll see you next episode.
Bye, guys.
Bye.